Welcome to our podcast. We're a group of friends that talk about our life, and our lives have been spent in ministry. Collectively, we have over 200 years of ministry experience. And what I'm going to throw out to the guys, and I'm going to actually lead first on this, is to remember back to what life was back in the sweet years when we were in our 40s. And what are things we wish we would have done differently in our 40s so that if you're in your 40s or anywhere around that, you could maybe learn some life lessons from our mistakes and our sense of what we wish we would have done differently. And one of the things in my 40s, I just thought way too much about myself. I wish I would have thought way more about God and about other people. And I cared about where I was perceived around other pastors and where my ministry was. I cared about people coming to Christ and our church growing. But part of that was this care about my reputation. And if I'm honest about it, as I reflect back, I wish someone would have just sat me down and said, you just would be so much more effective if you cared a little less about yourself and more about knowing God and more about just loving people. So that's one big thing. Thoughts on that, guys?
Well, you were trying to in essence, kind of build your ministry career, So I think that's pretty normal, actually, of a lot of people.
But I think it, at least in my life, got in the way of. I actually think it was detrimental to my ministry, because I just had it was too big a deal. So that's one of my lessons. How about you guys? Anything that you'd bring up or reflections on that thought?
I mean, in those days, it was like we started church planting in Sweden when I was 36, and we were having four children. One of our children was sick quite a bit, almost like a few years actually. Uh, back and forth all the time. And so I got very much focused on. We used to work much more together, but because of the sickness of our son, our youngest son, um, my wife was much less involved in the ministry. Before we always did things together. So I think when the church was a couple of years old, that I mean, we have to think like this. You start in our living room. This is not like maybe an American church where you start with 30 or 50 or 80 or 100 people. We start in our living room with a handful of people, and you start slowly growing. So I think there was a very imbalance in family life and involvement in trying to do what God has called you to do. So if I say if there's something I missed, I should have done things over. Now there's another problem with that, because there's a whole lot of people that only think of working in church is we have to work like a certain number of hours, and I don't believe that either. So there's this. You have to find like what does this calling is all about, and how do we work, especially as couples, with that, with all of the challenges and all of the responsibilities that we also carry besides the church. So that's one of the things that I should have learned. I should have done different when I was in my 40s. Yes.
What would have
Where were you in your 40s, Steve? Where were you?
Well, I was just thinking about it, and during my 40s, at least the visible signs of seeing prosperity in ministry were evident. But I think that the pace of ministry was such that I'm not sure that my personal life, personal spiritual growth, and maybe even relationship with my wife and kids. I'm just not sure. We we were traveling a great deal and with a church planting movement, and that usually involved some nights away from the community each week. And then, for whatever reason, God blessed the church as it was growing, and we had a small building. And so we had to have 4 weekend worship services, a Saturday night and 3 Sunday morning. And it seemed like most summer weekends we had a rehearsal wedding and then a wedding before all of that. And one of the things that I think that I learned, and I wish that someone would have sat down with me and talked about how my children and my wife's schedule went completely the opposite of a pastor's schedule. So my wife was a school teacher and my kids were in school, and that's Monday through Friday.
Yeah.
And I had Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
Yeah.
And so there was overt prospering of what was going on within the church. We ended up relocating to a new building, and that allowed us to get down to 3 services. But I kind of felt trapped with the 3rd service because we ended up reaching shift workers. The city that we were in, it's a wonderful city, but it was very blue collar. So we were reaching a bad weekend Saturday night service was 94, and a really big one was 106. And I just couldn't see closing down that when we got into the bigger building because they were shift workers and I love them. But I think the reality of how different the life of the pastor is versus his family, at least in America, when you have young children, and there was an expectation during that time that I would speak 48 weekends a year, and I always tried to fulfill any expectations. And so I think that it would have been really good for somebody just to have said, you have to give up something. God doesn't need you. God's letting you go on this journey.
I was on the other end a little bit because I had struggled more in my 30s. I had a church in my late 30s that actually, after being there a couple years, we ended up going through a split in the church, and we had voted on something as a church, and the vote was exactly 50 to 50% on either side. And so then the people that didn't get their way all left the church. They talked to each other into leaving, and all of a sudden, half my church was gone overnight. So by the time I got into my 40s, I was kind of saying, well, am I made to be a pastor? Should I stick with this? And was trying to discern that. And at the same time, I heard a quote actually on the radio. I loved sports always, and it was a sports show on the radio. And the guy said, well, the best investment you can ever make in your life is in your own skills and ability.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, Trinity Seminary in Deerfield, Illinois, was just changing their structure. And if you got into their doctoral program, the next fall, you would have to do 2 more courses. So I went into their doctoral program, and they gave me credit for some of the master's level courses I'd taken there with Warren Wiersbe. And Warren kind of became my mentor in those years and was a great help to me. So my 40s for me were the time educationally and with mentors to develop.
See, I think that's an interesting contrast because I know we'll ask John this, but for Steve and for me, we didn't really have mentors, that much of mentors in our 40s. And I think if I had had more mentors or I'd invited people to talk more honestly into my life, it might have helped me with some of that feeling like I was too important in the church, and like Steve mentioned, speaking you had to speak 48 times, but lots of times it would be 50 times. You just, and that meant you didn't raise up leaders and other speakers. So
Sure.
it seems like if you're in that era in your life, one question to ask yourself is, are you sharpening the saw? Do you have people that where you're gaining skills, and do you have any mentors or coaches speaking into your life? How was that era for you, John? Would you say you had good mentors?
No, and it's a little bit like you and Steve were in the beginning of like a church planting movement, and you were sort of pioneering that. I was also one of the, you could say, anyway, the church planting pioneers in modern history in Sweden, and especially also with the multicultural church, of course. So there were not many people that you could go to and that had experience in those fields. Um, and you became like maybe a sort of role model for others, even though, like, I mean, I remember so well that God spoke to me and said that the first so many years you're not supposed to go on conferences and speak about this. You just have to do it, and you have no authority to speak on these subjects and to go and to try to tell other people how to do that on conferences especially and stuff like that, which I never did. It took many years before I actually accepted the invitations on that. um, but at the same time, there was not much mentorship to be gained or to be asked for. And also, I mean, the whole concept of mentoring, I mean, we learned about that. I learned about it at Fuller. At the same time, to have that in practice in real life, that's another thing, unless you have a lot of relationships. So that didn't really work for me either. No.
Bill,
I think
go ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead,
I
Paul.
just was going to ask you, what did you feel like what were some of the gains for you from both the education and the mentors?
Well, again, the challenge in those days, I sat down with our regional director, in Converge in those days. This was in the suburbs of Chicago. And I said, you got to get me out of this church. This church, I'd been there 4 years. This place is killing me. I'm going to be out of ministry if I don't get something else. And he said, well, the only thing I've got is a church that just went through a split. Half the people left. And then after they left, a year after the split, the senior pastor died of cancer. And the church is, less than half of what it was. And they've got financial struggles and a lot of other problems. I said, I'll take it. So, desperation can lead you to looking for mentors and developing your skills, because I knew I was doing something wrong. I just didn't know what it was.
Steve, you've done a lot with mentoring and coaching
Yeah,
leaders. What
more than any of
what are
us.
some of the what would you say to people, particularly in their 40s, just about finding mentors, finding coaches, being teachable?
Well, I think by the time you're in your 40s, um, we have learned basic skill sets in terms of managing a church, regardless of what the polity would be. And we kind of understand what is required of us. So then I think I would really seek to go deep spiritually and take advantage of the fact that God is not at all finished in developing me in maturity. Now, I there have been mentors in my life and in Paul's life. We had Leith Anderson, who mentored us right out of seminary, and that was an amazing opportunity to have someone with great skills and great passion for the Lord. And then I also have had a 40-year relationship with Leighton Ford, who was a part of the Billy Graham organization, and met with him and a group for 40 years. And he dealt with the inner person far more than skill development. And And he always, every time I would take a walk with him during that week, he would say, Steve, you've started out well, but it's finishing well that is important.
Mm.
And he just kept on reminding me that. Now he's 94 now, and this year I'll hear the same words. And it's the idea of finishing well. When I we had a mentoring ministry where we covered the cost of people coming in, both secular leaders and ministry leaders, and they would live with us for a week, and we would cover their expenses, and we just tried to listen to them, and we tried to create a safe environment. And some of the times we would privately say pretty difficult things to them. Just the truth, but they had never heard that truth before. And but loving on them and encouraging them, I think, was really important. It tells us that there's a spiritual gift of encouragement, and then it also tells us that we're to encourage one another daily. So there is a practical part of our daily existence that we are to encourage, but then some people have this super duper ability, a gift from God, to recognize the best in a person, and we all need to be recipients of these types of people. And so I like to be a part of the giving, but I also feel very blessed when I'm receiving it.
John, as we wrap this up, you had mentioned a book that had influenced you that gave stages. Could you just talk about that book a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it was a small booklet written by Romano Guardini, who was born in Italy, became a German. He was a priest, Catholic priest, theologian, and philosopher. And he wrote a little book in German, Die Lebensalter, which means the stages of life. So I think it is translated. I read it in German, so I never got it in English, but I think it is in English, it's available. And he speaks about the different stage of life, how there is crisis in all of these stages, but also how our focus changes and how our responsibility changes. He speaks about, as people are in their teenage, about the passion and how that is forming the identity and the person. In early adulthood, he speaks about, between 20 and 35, about enterprise. As people turn 35 to 50, he talks about midlife. There's the contemplation and the growing of responsibility towards society. Then it's the mature adulthood, ages 50 to 80, of benevolence and mentorship and all of those kind of aspects that we have to grow into. And he refers to biblical examples all the time. Really, really strong teaching, I think. Then 80 plus is a late adulthood, where he speaks about the wisdom, the kind of wisdom that the Bible describes so well, with the gray hair and stuff like that. So we can be blessed also then. But then he talks about death and dying, where actually people are taught. This is also an important part for persons like me, who are dealing with facing potential death in diagnosis and stuff like that. How we can teach others to appreciate life more and to continue life until we come to this point. So I would really recommend it if you can find it. I know there is a professor at the Institute of forlearning.com in America. His name is Tom. He's used a lot of his material. He has developed his own stages of life, but he's actually integrated all of the stages that Guardini also mentioned. So that's at Institute for, with a for, learning.com resources. And then he speaks about 12 stages of life. Guardini has some other stages, but Thomas has integrated all of that, what he has read from Guardini.
Well, it's interesting, and I'll just do this as a wrap-up comment, because that a lot of what we've been talking about is a stage that he's describing as contemplation. And I think one of the things you heard from Bill is he took time to do studies and have more mentors. Steve mentioned mentors. One question to you is, do you have enough time in your life to contemplate, to look at what you're doing, to look at who you're becoming, and then have people in your life that can actually speak truth to you? And I know I wish I had heard this talk back when I was 39, turning 40. Hey, thanks for joining us today, and we'll look forward to connecting you on our podcast another time.